several of us have been having conversations over the last couple of months about just what this regime means, what it looks like, and have chosen, I think, after kind of on reflection, to recognize that that this regime that has recently been elected, and I, for one, choose not to mention names attached to it, does constitute a movement toward fascism in this country. And it's of deep concern to us. And we're also concerned about what it means for the academy. And that we know historically the academy has suffered under such regimes. And we think it's really important for us to locate ourselves in relation to it and think about how we are going to respond and react. So I'm really very, very thankful to have with us today a co-convener of Academics Against Fascism, Dr. Phil Rice, a practicing emergency room physician who is also, despite that, his vest and tie, or maybe in fact, a true revolutionary, and one who has really devoted a great deal of his time and attention to thinking about and really coming to understand the forces that shape the society in which we live and the world economy. I don't want to kind of belabor it, except to say I think we're very fortunate to have him talk to us this afternoon about the kinds of things we need to be doing. And I've asked him to say a little bit about himself by way of introduction. So, Phil, please.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is this mic doing what it's supposed to do? Okay. Yeah, so David asked me to give a brief history of myself. I went to undergrad at Stanford in the late 70s, 75 through 79. And there I'd taken some courses on economics. I was an econ major, and then went to med school based on an econ major. I did a lot of biology and the chemistry and all the other things, and then went to medical school in Washington, D.C. And afterwards, it was during the time of Ronald Reagan that I decided to do emergency medicine. The reason being is that, one, there was a snafu in me doing a surgical rotation. And then two is that I wanted to have skills that in case there were a nuclear war, because at the time, if people who remember the days of Ronald Reagan and his MX Peacekeeper missiles, et cetera, it seemed like the clock, the scientists, the atomic clock to nuclear war was ticking towards midnight, you know. And I decided that if I were to survive a nuclear war, and that's not a given, obviously, because all the missiles are aimed here, or a lot of them, what skills would I like to have in order to best serve humanity afterwards? Well, there wasn't a nuclear war, not yet. And I ended up finishing, and when I went to school with a bunch of people, in particular, there was quite a few Ethiopians who were fighting the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia. And we used to just talk late at night. How do you make revolution in the middle of the night? Because you can't make it in the daytime because the Mengistu's troops were everywhere. I went to school with people in different parts of Africa, from different parts of Africa. I went to school with some Eastern European folks who had said, you know, we've seen what socialism, we've seen what fascism looks like, you know, we don't want to go back there. So we used to have these wrangling discussions. In short, during my later years in medicine, I did international emergency medicine, where I used to go through different countries and try and set up infrastructure to allow the masses of people and the doctors on the ground to be able to develop the skills and teaching abilities to keep what we gave them and expand it so that they could give better care to their own population. But each time I went there, as I was telling David, I kept coming back to the singular understanding that their problem is not one of medicine. It's their political economy, it's their politics, it's who's running the country, who backs them. That's what's killing the people and making them unhealthy. And each time we ended up getting into discussions about revolution. And how do you make it? How do you change the world? How do you make it in in a beautiful, picturesque view that we can and we aspire to, as opposed to what exists then and there, which is just minority factions fighting amongst themselves, grabbing power to enrich just themselves or their benefactors in one mainly either European, US, or Japanese, one of the imperial countries. That's what existed, and that's what exists. So it was with that that I have recognized and been political most of my life. And I have joined with various Maoist groups and talked about Mao because I thought Mao had a very good program. I mean, the whole Barefoot Chinese Doctors, I had that manual, said, this is what I need in case there will be no pharmaceutical companies. How do I make my own medicines from plants, et cetera? And this book actually showed you how to do that, even though we don't have the same foliage and plants here in this country that they did in China. That was part of it. So part of the thing is that's my kind of a short history of my movement in search of truth and figuring out what's true in the world. And the morality that intersects with that is when you find out what's true, what do you need? What do you feel compelled to do about it? And that's what's the other aspect of it. It's not enough to just say that, at least in my opinion, that this is horrible, this is bad, and then sit and read the New York Times. That's not good enough. As a human being, I feel a connection to other human beings. Some say that's the way I grew up. My father was in the Air Force. We went embassy hopping in many countries. By the time I was 11, I'd lived in 14 different countries. I went to school with kids of other countries. They had the same dreams, aspirations, desires, wants as I did. And just because they were born on a different part of the planet than I was, didn't make them any less human or less deserving of care and warmth and all the good things in life. I grew up opposing, from my own perspective, this American exceptionalism aspect. We're not exceptional. We're the same flesh and blood, and as a doctor, I know we're the same flesh and blood. I treat patients every day from different parts of the countries with different languages who can't speak or talk to me except through an interpreter, and they've got the same diseases and ills. So there is no such thing as the American exceptionalism as much as we want to believe. What there is a history, and that history is something we need to review time and again, because it gets the alternative facts of these days keep twisting that history as to what really happened and what existed in prior times. That's all the more important now as we've had institutions that we've come to know and realize that or recognize as democracy. Some call it bourgeois democracy, some call it democracy. There's parliamentary democracy, but there is a time and a place where you vote and you decide, you try to decide who runs things in your interests or not. And you have courts, and you have a Congress, and you have an executive. So when we see these elements, we felt comfortable with them because that's what I've only known. I haven't grown up in any other kind of framework, but I've seen its ills. I've also seen in other countries where they've adopted similar things, similar ills. At the same time, there's the history that's not too long ago where in the early part of the 20th century, Mussolini came to power describing his fascist doctrine. It was embraced by the Nazis, and there were some very common threads to all this. Thank you. And in terms of what they put forward. And when we see what Trump, Pence, and his regime have put forward, it seems like the same playbook. There are things lifted directly from it, and therefore it's not an exaggeration to call it fascism. It really is. That's what it is. That's their doctrine. It's an ultra xenophobic fear of strangers and foreigners, especially ones that have darker skins, fear of any kind of dissent. There can be no dissent. And it is a doctrine of ultranationalism, in particular ultra-white nationalism. And so the people that are quote-unquote spared or given first-class status are white males, not white females, white males. Those that go along with them, they will be spared future trauma as long as they don't object or dissent. So we've seen some of the characteristics of what Mussolini did back in Italy in the 1920s when he went after the courts. And in a very similar fashion, almost 5-6 years later, when Hitler went after the courts, set up a parallel court system. If you read, there's a book by Claudia Kuntz called The Nazi Conscience, where she just picks how they, piece by piece by piece, and how they did it was they didn't just put out their full program right in front of everybody. What they did was they did a little step, let people get used to it, then put another step, made that normalized, did another step, made that normalized, until people look back and realize where they'd come from that looked nothing like where they are. And that's exactly what we see is being played out in front of us. And part of that assault is an assault on the church and state. It's an assault on science and truth. It's an assault on the press, trying to figure out what's true and what's not. It's an assault on the Constitution. And it's an assault on the church, certain parts of the church that don't conform to what we call the Christian fascist ideology that's pretty much had been headed up by Pat Robertson and the Jerry Falwell group, etc. So that assault on the nation's courts, we've seen it when he's been talking about the so-called judges, railing about, that the courts seem to have too much power and that there isn't an equal power amongst them. It seems like the Supreme Court is above all of them. And we've seen the whole thing about the assault on science and the truth, which is where, when we look back in history, Hitler did the same thing. Only the thing is there wasn't that much opposition in a large section of the universities to his program, and which we've decided as Academics Against Fascism, that's not going to happen. We are going to oppose his assault on truth and science. And what we've seen is that there's a very big aspect of why he's doing this. People keep saying, well, why wouldn't you want the truth? Why wouldn't you want science? You need science. You have to have all these things in order to progress, etc. Even your vaunted military needs science to build bigger and more nasty weapons, etc. You need science. Well, part of this, I think, is an attack upon what he called in his inaugural address, an attack upon the elite who've, quote unquote, led us to this precipice of disaster. And what he means by those elites are the universities. That's what he means. That's who he's aiming at. Mussolini did the same thing, and so did Hitler. And Franco did to a large extent, although he focused a lot of his attention in the Catalonia area, in the Barcelona, in the region that wanted to break away. I remember I saw when you go to Barcelona, there's a big hill and there's a big mansion up there. That was his residence up there from which he ruled part of that area. But they attacked the universities to clamp down on free speech, to clamp down on academic science and freedom that did not comport with their overall goals, whether it be to further the whole prospect of building the wall and demonizing this group versus that group versus blacks in the inner cities, which he's threatened to unleash his shock troops in order to fix the problem. He has talked about Gitmo being a great place for criminals, etc. So it is in this light that we see that what he is bringing out, this is right out of the textbook of previous fascists that have openly declared themselves as fascists. And we can look at more contemporary elements, such as Erdogan of Turkey, excuse me, and we have in Egypt a similar aspect where the people kind of thought, geez, if we bring in the military will save us. Well, what they got was, a fascist regime where the military openly rules through brutal, open terror. And the same thing is happening in Turkey right now, where people are being terrorized. Teachers, I mean, there's teachers, physicians. I worked at Brigham for 10 years, and part of my international work was in Romania and also in Turkey. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Arafat, he was actually a Palestinian, not related to the Arafat that was leader of the PLO. He actually developed these standalone emergency departments there. And so we used to go to these standalone emergency departments and try and see if we couldn't give emergency medicine, because it was a concept that wasn't really on the surface at all in these countries. If you had money and you could go to the hospital, you went. If you didn't, you stayed in your village, and people who had experience with health problems, they took care of your problems. So I'm not talking about Botswana, I'm talking about Romania. This is how it was. And to some extent, it is still the same case in places like Hungary, et cetera. There are hospitals there, but in terms of emergency care, where somebody who has a heart attack, where do they go? How do was there an ambulance system to take you there? That doesn't exist. And then, so we used to go over to Turkey, and we would bring the Turkish doctors over to Brigham, and they'd stay for a while and see how, and get the picture of what it's supposed to look like. So when they went back and we went back with them, this is what we do. So I'd gotten these Facebook and emails from these doctors who said, is there something you can do? Write your senators, et cetera. Dr. So-and-so has just been taken by Erdogan and his crew, and for no reason at all other than we've been trying to promote truth, health and science. So no scientist there is safe. And the same thing is true on campuses across this country. And this actually, the American Academy of Sciences, American Advancement of Science, AAAS, that was one of the things that was brought out there, that it didn't matter whether you tried to just do your science in your little hole. You could be attacked simply because of what you were doing your science about. You do not have the freedom to do climate change science. We are going to silence this because it does not comport with where we need to go as a nation, that cohered nation. And it doesn't comport with unbridled expansion of the empire of part of globalization. So when we look at that and we see that, there is these attacks coming down, and just a show of hands, how many people have heard of the watch list? Almost everybody. Okay, so this is a Koch brother-inspired group that's been going on for at least 12 years, I believe, maybe 13, where they have singled out professors in campuses who espouse ideas and have open and give time to discussion in classes concerning ideas that they oppose. And those people get on a watch list, they're publicized and vilified, and if you've opposed them, they have threatened with lawyers to bring you to court for libel, etc. So this is not an idle chatter about minor issues. These are real things that affect people and professors and academia, and it affects people who pay to come to these universities, what they're getting, what they're learning, and the ability to see and touch and feel and smell different things that may not go along with the current wave of thinking that may be dominant. Because what is dominant today wasn't so 5, 10 years ago. And so part of the thing is to recognize what's up and coming so that you can actually plan and prepare for your future. So it's with that in mind that we now know, looking back in history, that the universities were a prime area of attack of all the fascists. And we're beginning to see elements of that, and we need to prepare for that. So in that light, we developed a group called Academics Against Fascism. And it has done quite a bit, and I was trying to bring a couple of my colleagues from MIT here to also talk about their work there. But we'd like to spread it across the nation so that there can be the type of force that opposes the attacks that have already been happening and are unquestionably going to intensify in the next coming period. He has to squelch, quote unquote, the truth, because as we've seen, with lots of attention being paid to the alternative facts that they keep spewing out. I mean, Bernie Sanders just said, "What do you do about a president who lies?" Well, it's obvious he's lying. He's lied on 1,000 different things. And the thing that I think people miss sometimes when I talk with them is that there's a purpose to him lying over and over again. It's not just that he was born a prefabricator, fabricating truths, but he probably did when he was a kid. But the thing is that he's teaching people how to think. That's part of the program of the fascists, is don't believe this and the press, the fake news. Forget about that. Listen to what I say. Follow my tweets and act on my tweets is the next aspect. Now, Hitler had the radio. Mussolini had the radio. And just as they had a regular press, Goebbels took over them. He just squelched them. And unless they conformed, he crushed them. And the Nazi program would not tolerate anything other than the official program of Nazi Germany at that time. Mussolini did the same thing. And so when we look at how they attack the press and how that's an integral aspect of it, that's also an aspect of trying to confuse people on, geez, what is true, what's not true? Can we really know the truth? Can we really trust the press? Since he's saying that it's fake news. And is there any truth to this fake news? It begins to make the people who aren't his staunch followers begin to question what's true and what's not. Is the earth I'm standing on really on a globe, or is it flat? Type thing. So I think that recognizing that, you have to say, what's the answer to that? You have to have a no. We're not going to go along with this. There are things that we do know. There are things that are accepted as fact, such as evolution. There are lots of things that we know in the world. The climate change is real. The climate change data is real. But just like in Nazi Germany, there was an institute for sexual studies there, which focused mainly on homosexuality and bisexuality and studying of that. They burned, and on May 6, 1933, they stormed that institute, took out every book, and burned them. 12,000 books. They shut it down, obviously, and of course, they assaulted all the homosexuals and the lesbians, and the entire LGBT community was just decimated. They were attacked physically. And so the tweets can very easily turn into something else. We've already seen at his rallies the violence, and not just the violence, but his encouragement of it. And it appalled a number of people that, geez, this is a political rally. There should be people who come here and oppose. But no, they were assaulted, and he said, I will pay for the assaulters' legal bills, encouraging it. So we've seen from a number of angles that as a scientist, one of the things that you do is you learn and try and figure out pattern recognition. That's what the difference between a very young doctor coming out of medical school and one who's 65, 70 years old. The difference between them is, one, the younger one should be smarter. I always tell my residents, you should be smarter than me. You've done your stuff on top of the things that we've done here, but also, I've seen 40,000 more patients than you have. I have pattern recognition. So when I see people come in with different symptoms, it doesn't take me long to figure out it's probably 1, 2, or 3 problems. And then I work them up, get labs, get x-rays, et cetera, to help me winnow down which one it most likely is, and then treat it. The young ones don't have that pattern recognition, but that's what science is about. It's about pattern recognition. When you see the evidence, you put it together, and you call it what it is. If it's cancer, it's cancer. And you tell people, you've got cancer. And you tell them the truth. It's their body. They have a right to know. They came to you to find out what's wrong with them. It may not be good news, but it's the truth, as best you know it. And it's okay to tell them you don't know also. But when you do know it, and the facts add up, you tell them what's going on. And so when we look at what's going on now, and we see all these factors coming in, his assault on the nation's courts, the assault on the separation between church and state, the assault on science, and the assault on tolerance of other peoples and cultures. That's all part of the external enemies. And I had trying to think what I did with it, but I had a piece here which talked about Mussolini's definition, because it was actually the only official definition at the time, but others have written about it. Number one, everything in the state. The government is supreme and the country is all-encompassing, and all within it must conform to the ruling body, often a dictator. 2, nothing outside the state. The country must grow, and the implied goal of any fascist nation is to rule the world and have every human submit to the government. Number 3, nothing against the state. Any type of questioning the government is not to be tolerated. If you do not see things our way, you are wrong. If you do not agree with the government, you cannot be allowed to live and taint the minds of the rest of the good citizens. The use of militarism is key in providing the tranquility of and the no internal strife in the state. That's Mussolini's own definitions. And everything that we're seeing now, his attack on the press, I mean, he does it almost daily. His attack on the courts, it's a Mexican judge, so-called judge. The Ninth Court of Appeals is they don't know what they're doing. Hitler was opposed initially by some courts, and during the burning down of the Reichstag, there were a bunch of communists who were accused of burning it down, and all but one was acquitted. And he lost. The judges, basically said no. So what did he do? He set up a parallel court system. They said yes. The same thing can happen here. And we see elements of him beginning to do that. This, lastly, is making sure that all state governments and legislators are in line. And those that don't keep in line with him, he threatens them and bludgeons them into submission. And we're seeing part of that process begin to develop now. But right now, we can see that he hasn't quite consolidated his regime yet, but he's got into place all the elements that he needs. The militarization of his cabinet, everything he sees is from a military, it's a war. And it is from this perspective that we've got to respond and recognize that the usual methods and institutions that you've relied upon in order to combat something like this, those aren't steady enough to deal with this. They're not large enough to deal with this. Therefore, the people themselves have to take things into their hands to a certain extent and work outside the confines of accepted political discourse. Because the accepted, he's going to roll right over those. And we've seen he doesn't recognize any of them. And so a lot of people have asked, how could this happen here? You know? Well, it was actually mirroring times, similar circumstances when we've seen it in other countries, where there has been feuding and difficulty in moving things forward. And there are times when, in what we call the movement of globalization, of how capitalism, imperialism moves from one conjuncture to the next, usually marked by World War, that we see that as we approach the next conjuncture, that many of these types of dictators and regimes come into being. And it's been quite a while since World War II. But we saw before World War I, there was a wave of them. And now we're seeing another wave. And we're seeing the rise of the populist kind of proto-fascists in Europe that are rising up and trying to actually do the same thing that Trump did here, or that the Brexit vote did in England or the United Kingdom. So with that, I wanted to talk about what we've attempted to do. We've linked up with the refusefascism.org. It's an organization that had many signers convened in New York City. People may recognize some of the names of the original founders, Jeremy Scahill, and wrote Blackwater and some other books. There have been a number of other people that were part of this. You can go to the website and see what they put forward. But in there, they also explicitly talk about why the pattern fits fascism, and why this is fascism, and what we need to do about it. And part of what we feel we need to do about it is to do things just like this. Have meetings, talk about this, see what we've come up against, see what we're dealing with, share people's experiences, and also put out our no sign. We're not going to go along with it. Put out that we are not going to tolerate this. We are not going to be good Germans in that sense. Because it was shameful what some people accepted back in the 30s. It was. And we are not going to occupy that same seat. So part of what it says is our single unifying mission must be to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. Now, people say, geez, how can you possibly drive out a regime like Trump and Pence? Well, if you think about it, it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, when Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson, Goldwater ran in 1964 on let's bomb them into the Stone Age. And Lyndon Johnson was the more peace candidate. Everybody said, we don't want war, let's go for Lyndon Johnson. A week or two after he gets in, he escalates the war to heights we had never seen before. And everybody said, geez, I thought we voted for the peace candidate. And then people started to oppose the war. And I mean, there was a movement. There were millions of people in the streets such that GIs felt that they had their backs so that they didn't have to go and carry out orders like the My Lai massacres that happened in Vietnam. They could refuse orders. They weren't going to fight like that and kill innocent men, women, and children. They weren't going to be part of the indiscriminate killing machine. And there was the old interesting fact that 90% of all ground officers in Vietnam died at the hands of their own men, not by the enemy. And that's because people refused and rebelled. But how free would they have felt to rebel had they not had that huge movement and mass uprising back in the United States? And also told people of the world that the people of the United States weren't all with this. And soon, long enough, when millions of people were against the war, Nixon was moved out. And Lyndon Johnson was moved out. So there are times when, if there are people outside normal workings of the institutions who decide to step out of those bounds and get into the streets and voice their opinions on an ever-increasing and escalating manner. The day after the inauguration was a good start, but it's not enough, because these people can absorb blows like that because they have a rapid-paced program. They're going to put out one thing after the next, after the next, after the next. Muslim ban, then it'll be something else, then it'll be something else. And it's hard to keep up with that. And the only thing that's going to do that is taking out of the silos of the anti-immigration versus the anti-gay, lesbian, LGBT to the Black Lives Matter, or the because that could be next. You've got to wield them all together into a force that says, we're not going to accept this. So our single unifying mission must be to drive out the Trump-Pence regime, and that's part of how you do it. We must manifest the no sign everywhere. This is the no sign. Okay, people may have seen it on TV and some of the demonstrations, but this is the no sign. And that's actually part of what we want, so that it's uncompromising in the sense that we are not going to accommodate, we're not going to conciliate, we're not going to collaborate, we're going to oppose this, and we're not going to normalize what they're doing, which is what they aim to do. They aim to normalize each step. So each outrage committed by this regime must be met with greater and greater resistance. And we must organize. And part of that organization is, like I said, coming to bring your own lunch, even though I don't see anybody eating, to one of these things, and we'll talk about that. So it's 1:45 now, and I know we only have till 1, so I want to kind of just wrap up with a point that fascism is not just a combination of backward policies. That's not what it is. It's greater than the sum of its parts, because it militarizes things and takes away your civil liberties, whether it be women's reproductive rights, whether it be the civil rights with the stop and frisk, which Donald Trump says need more of that, not less, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's the LGBT community and the war on them, the questions of Islamophobia and the war on Islam, the war on the Mexicans, and then their attempts to break the sanctuary cities and sanctuary campuses. We have to look at each and every human being that we meet, whether they're from here or not, whether they're illegal or not. We have to protect them as they're seeking their education and they're here, whether they're here working, etc. This is all to confront and oppose what we see as this fascist move and fascism coming to the fore. We have to, because unlike Hitler, this guy has 3,500 intercontinental nuclear missiles, and he has a bunch more, which is classified, we don't know how many, tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, which they have said could be used at any point in time. And in fact, he's actually championed, what do we have these weapons for if we don't use them? So we have the potential where humanity's existence is at stake. That's what drives me to do what I'm doing. That's what drives me to implore to you, we'd have work to do. Let's get organized. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks. I've been around a little bit longer than you, so I learned how to duck and cover in grade school.
Yes, I remember that too.
I'd like to volunteer a symbol for this organization. I was actually 2 weeks ago at the Rally for Science at Copley Square.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
My father was in Italy during World War II, and he was with the partisans when they found Mussolini and his mistress and his group And they were all shot there. They were then taken into Milan and hung upside down at a gas station. I have a picture of that. My dad took it, a little brownie. It's in my house in California. But that should be our rallying cry, seriously, because that's how these people end up. Now, I know Donald Trump from a golf tournament in Vail many years ago, and I saw him kick his ball onto the green. But my point of all this is I just spent 6 years at Oxford University working on climate change. And I'm not on that list you mentioned by the Koch brothers, because I'm also a lawyer. But I didn't see in Europe, I didn't see this make Germany great, make France great, make Italy great, make England great, that I saw when I came back here. And it scares the hell out of me, because I know that Trump isn't the issue. The real issue in this thing, I think, is the person that's really leading this, the Grim Reaper, a.k.a. Bannon. That's who wants to tear down democracy. Trump isn't smart enough. Trump is a foil, in my opinion. He is, I won't dignify clowns, but my point is that this fascism or alt-right, or whatever you want to call it, didn't come from Trump. That isn't his issue. His issue was ego. And what the good news is that in England, betting is legal, and the odds that when he was elected president, and we're sworn it was 3-1, he would survive 4 years without being impeached or resign. Now it's even money. Now, unfortunately, Pence is 33-1. So I don't think we'll get rid of Pence, but I think we can get rid of Trump. But if we can tie Pence to what's obvious, maybe we can. But Pence doesn't scare me. Trump scares me, and Bannon scares me, and Miller scares me.
Those are some very good points. I think that when we look back on Hitler, just to use him, not Mussolini, but the notes on Hitler were that the elite of the country, the academics, they looked at him and saw a buffoon, especially back in the 20s, and said, he's not a threat to us. There's no way he could, to a soul, they all said, there's no way this buffoon could become, chancellor. And the thing is that, yes, they had a description of him eating in a bar. I think his name was Mann, Klaus Mann, who was an author. Saw him eating in a restaurant, and he was stuffing his face like a pig, just with hands. And it just said he's this is a pig, And this guy is not a threat to us. Just as the way we saw Trump back in 2004, he was a buffoon, or 2008, he was a buffoon, The problem is that that's why I don't, even though Trump is the kind of leading the edge of this because of his name, it's the Trump-Pence regime and what it represents. Yes, Bannon is part of that, and what he represents and what he believes is very much that of a white Christian, male, patriarchal dominance is under assault. The immigration, especially from non-white people, is not just immigration. It's an insidious war, is how he describes it. And he describes a view that is, that's why the wall is being built on the southern border, not the northern border. Even though the border on the north is far longer and more people cross over than the southern border, what he's worried about is that preserving that white nationalism. So yes, he's a white nationalist. Anybody who's read any of his writings on the Breitbart and the stuff that he, as chief editor, was allowing on his station, it's very clear where he's coming from. And now he sits, inches away from the president, has the president's ear. So in that sense, you're absolutely right that there are people behind him and theoreticians that are behind them, but at the same time, it's a regime. Hitler had his regime, and the point is to drive out both of them. Hence, you should be scared of him. He's a Christian fascist. This guy, if you read his writings and what he stood for and what he's been about, he believes in a literal biblical interpretation of things, such as bumping off anyone such as children who talk back to their parents, and people who are gay and lesbian, should be stoned to death, and women who have sex outside of marriage. This guy is Stone Age criteria, and
He's not going to start a nuclear war.
I don't bet that.
Do you really think that? I hate conservatives. I hate what you talk about. My point is that he at least is rational. He's a lawyer, like me. And that's the big difference whether you like it or not. But we did take it over. And I just don't see Pence doing that. Now, I would like to see Pence go to it, don't get me wrong. I would like to see him go before Trump. But my point is that it's Bannon that's driving this. It's the Russians that are driving this. I mean, it's very simple to understand. The fact is that as you minimize America, the rest of the world is really scared. And I saw that in Europe. And nobody in Europe thought that Trump was going to win. I'm not sure anybody in America was going to win. But my point is, there's ways to take that down. I think the way to take it down is exactly what you're doing. Remember that organization you mentioned, the middle of the run. We have to have these rallies. We have to have these lectures. We have to have people like you who have seen these insidious things that are happening in other countries, the doctors that you work with. I mean, I want to applaud you for what you've done, because I'm very serious about this. I was in the medical service corps. I know that it's very numb, and I know the dedication of doctors in the jungle that I was with. They're willing to give up their lives to keep other soldiers alive. I have a friend who's a doctor that kept his, from save the soldier by keeping his finger on the press all the way to the back hospital in the jungle. And, can you imagine doing that for a couple of hours? I mean, you're a doctor.
Not for a couple hours, but I've done similar.
Yes, hi, my name is Laura Correa Ochoa. I'm a PhD student in Latin American and Caribbean history. I'm wondering what you think the institutional obligations of universities, in particular Ivy League universities like Harvard, ought to be. Harvard has refused to become a sanctuary campus, for example, amongst a set of taking very limited precautions or made very limited assertions regarding the Trump administration. So what do you think the responsibility ought to be in it?
Yes, I actually have very strong feelings about this. I think that each university should take an uncompromising stand, like this says, of no. We are not going to participate in this. And we are going to be sanctuaries as best we can. We are not going to have our campus police turn into the Gestapo that breaks down student dorms, trying dragging people out who are illegals and hand them over to the immigration and enforcement agencies. So I think that without a doubt that each campus needs to organize and vociferously tell their administrations, you need to do this, point one. You need to protect the students that are here. We are all here to learn. And we are all here to oppose this that's coming from, regardless of whether they threaten to cut off your funds or not. This is the right stand. This is what is morally correct.
Bill about MIT, I think there's some serious work going on at MIT. That's very disruptive. Is anyone here from MIT?
not. I mean, MIT has done a number of things. One, the faculty have signed letters that, and it started with the faculty, in fact, signed letters that stated that, one, that they were going to stand with people who were on the watch list. Two, they were not going to participate in the extension of their university to the requests to turn over names of illegals and things like that. They fought against any, I mean, their letter basically states that we are not going to be part of this. And the administration should not be part of this. So this, they've organized groups. There's a April 18th a program where they're going to have also a fair of some sort, an educational fair around this very topic, where people can come and lecture and talk and discuss and put forward their viewpoints about what to do, what progress has each made at various campuses. I mean, it has to happen at Boston University, Tufts. It's got to happen in all these Brandeis, every one of them across the city. Yeah, we'll send you that stuff.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's really powerful to hear from someone in the medical community about like the importance of standing up to this administration. Along the lines of what you've just described with the sanctuary, making this place a sanctuary and having a unified front on it, we're actually so I'm with the Harvard Graduate Student Union as well and the International Student Working Group, and we're actually working to tap our networks across different university campuses and formulate a unified petition to ask for sanctuary in a very legally codified way. Previously, requests for sanctuary have been more general in terms of not cooperating with ICE, not divulging names, but I think there could be something much more active that's based in precedents for sanctuary and past instances where we've needed to provide that. So I have here a draft of this front matter of this petition. I'd like to pass it around if any of you would like to work together to draft this. We're hoping the next week to pass this out to various unions across campus and across other campuses, and hopefully be able to circulate this to the student bodies and workers.
How long is it? Why don't you read a paragraph or two?
Yes, I can do that. To the leadership of our educational, faith-based, and medical institutions, we, the undersigned and members of your institutions, write to request clear commitments to protect our international and immigrant communities against current and anticipated future threats to their dignity, well-being, and livelihoods. We believe that safeguarding this community, their rights, and their freedom of movement is integral to our academic, medical, and faith-based missions. U.S. President Donald Trump has launched xenophobic and racist attacks on our immigrant community members and explicitly threatened their ability to stay in this country. In particular, recent executive orders expand interior immigration enforcement and ban the entry of foreign nationals from some Muslim-dominant countries. While the legitimacy of these executive orders continues to be questioned by our judicial system, their virulence is derived from their ambiguity, from the expansion of the workforce and discretion of Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and from the persistent threat of new executive orders and memoranda targeting immigrants and people of color. Recent bureaucratic changes to the processing of visas also demonstrate a silent and perhaps more effective method of staunching the flow of immigrants that compose the fabric of our nation. Given that the bodies of our institution are majority immigrant, these measures have created great uncertainty and anxiety for our communities. In addition to sowing fear, leaked memoranda suggest that our faith-based scholarly and medical communities may be subject to direct immigration enforcement. A recent leaked memorandum from the Trump administration rescinds all Obama-era memoranda and field guidance for immigration enforcement officers. In particular, the sensitive locations memo under President Obama originally designated schools, places of worship, and hospitals off limits for immigration enforcement, and recent events suggest that the Department of Homeland Security is already not upholding the spirit of this memo. We believe that protecting our immigrant population and therefore the integrity of our communities will depend on the following categories of guarantees. And then we list a series of possible legal areas that we can actually write down guidelines for. And
Well, that to me is a tremendous step forward.
I do. I'll give you the paper copy and I'll share it. Yep.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Hi, my name's Jessica Panzerino, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. And I was just wondering, well, drawing direct parallels with the fascism of the 1930s and 40s, while I think there are parallels, and this is certainly fascism, we also live in a very different world. And I think the tools are going to change. They're going to be different. And I think that it might be more helpful to look towards sci-fi books as to see what's coming. For instance, you know, the Black Panthers were taken out through assassination and imprisonment. That's not necessary anymore. All they need to do is discredit and lie through the media. We don't have a free press, and the press that is free is only being only the people that are, you know, already enlightened are reading those papers, so that we have two sets of press for this country, and that's horrible. So I think that trying to come up with solutions that kind of breaks down those barriers is the only way we're going to be able to get rid of this administration, but also see it not rise again. And I think that the universities on the East Coast and the West Coast need to reach out to these universities in the middle of the country. And that might be actually something that would gain traction. That's my idea.
Good points, good points. Part of the things concerning the narrative of Middle America and then the coasts, it's actually not that simple. And I finished high school in Rantoul, Illinois, in the cornfields. And I still talk with my old friends, etc. They're as aghast as I am at what they see rearing its head here in this country. And people got to remember that about 40-something% of the entire population didn't even vote. And half of that, more than half of that, voted for Hillary, and less than half of that voted for Trump. So when people talk about there's a 50-50 split, that's not true. You have a quarter who voted for him, you have a quarter who voted against him, and then you have a mass of people who said, maybe voting doesn't really change things for me, or I don't believe in voting, or whatever the reason. That's the majority. It's that section that I think people have to keep their eyes on and say, what do they believe? Along with, you know, his hardcore supporters. I don't think you're going to reach some of those hardcore supporters. I don't think we should not talk to them, and I don't think we should not publicize it amongst them. But I think that where our focus should be is on the other three quarters.
Hi, my name's Erin. I'm a staff member here at Harvard. So one of the things that is so exciting about this group is the number of faculty members and professionals who are lending their support and their voices to this effort. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of students and staff at universities as well. I think that some of us are struggling to find the best way to use our energies and how to enter into this fight as well. You know, I think that, you know, possibly it is putting some pressure on faculty members as well to join and speak up. But I also think that some of us are in a unique position where we're not asking for funding from the same people that faculty members are. And so we may be insulated in a different way than they are. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world where credentials seem to be everything. You know, you're not allowed to speak unless you have these credentials. You're not allowed to have a voice. But what really gives you a voice is what you have to say. It's the content of what you say. It's not my MD. I got lots of my medical doctor friends who say, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to go churn out the next patient, go see the next 5 folks in the waiting room. And then they look the next day and those same 5 folks are back again and they wonder what happened. Well, they had no access to care. Well, why is that? You know. So the content of what you say is what's critical. And it's grasping that that gives you a voice. So yes, there are professors and doctors, et cetera, some who are grant funded, some who are not grant funded. I mean, some of them, they were very pissed off in the 2000s early on because their grant funding dried up. If you did not have Defense Department related research, NIH wasn't going to give you a grant, you know, or very little unless you were one of the biggies in the cancer or cardiac world. So there are many people who are not part of that edifice, but who actually do a lot of the things that make the place run, that have their voices just as important. And in fact, can magnify and go in many places and can organize in many ways that, you know, may seem like there are barriers to for other people who can't, such as physicians, you know, or professors. Or so I would like to say that by all means, our aim is to grasp the concepts, grasp the material, and then get it out. When I say drive out the Trump-Pence regime, what's going to actually do that? It's not going to be doctors and lawyers in the streets. There are too few of them. That can't possibly drive. We need them, without a doubt, but that can't possibly alone drive them out. We need people. And I'm not putting a prefix and a suffix around the word people in terms of what they do. I'm talking about everybody. If you recognize this and you do not want to live under a fascist regime, then there's work to do. And so my answer is that the students have to press their professors. The students have to talk amongst themselves. The students have to talk amongst the people who work at the university, the unions of different workers, whether it be, I mean, one of the things that I do at the hospital is I talk to all my janitors. That's one of the funnest things I have to do. I'll see patients, and then when it's like 4 in the morning and it starts to die down, and I see them mopping and stuff and cleaning out the rooms, because I tell them, you know, as much as I do, if these rooms were filthy, no one would ever get well. You have as much a part in keeping people well as I do. I'm the doctor. You're the one with all the cleaning materials. You're the ones who wipes the walls and make sure that multi-drug resistant bacteria don't get spread to the next room, et cetera, et cetera. That's critical. You know, so I speak to the janitors. I talk to them. I tell them, this is what you guys got to do. You know, this is what I think would be helpful. You tell me what you think. And then I listen. I listen to where they come from, where their history is, what they're dealing with. So there's lots of room for everybody, and everybody has a role to play. And there aren't enough of us just yet.
If we're going to take Congress back, we can't stop it. It's that simple. We have to take Congress back next year. Otherwise, we can't stop it. It's impossible. That's the reason they're there, because they've got Congress, they got the presidency. We have to take Congress back. We have to put all our focus on taking Congress back.
I think if we waited till then, this group will be in power, and the whole thing will be solidified, and it'll be too late then. I think history shows that if you wait till the next elections, we can't.
I'm going to say that right now we do all these rallies, which leads up to taking Congress back. We have to keep these rallies up. That's good to take Congress back. Now, I think they're going to step on their foot with Trump here.
So, you know, listen, I want to say I really appreciate everybody being here. I wanted to announce also that this group meets regularly, that we're meeting on March 20th I think we just got a room. I'll try to put that in an email to folks if you want to be involved. And I would say to you that I think that it was a janitor who changed Yale forever. You all know what he did? He broke that window, right? And that simple act, right, precipitated a huge change in the way that place operated. And, you know, it was because he was tired of cleaning those tables under that window depicting his ancestors, right? And I think, just to reinforce what Phil is saying, that's really critical. You have UAW. I mean, you know, I think we really have to think about how we're all engaged, and we invite you all to join us, right?
Please.
As we try to move forward. Because the point, look, if I can, I'm sorry. The fact is that we need faculty members in this room. And that we really need the students and the staff to help make that happen, right? So with that, I want to kind of extend my really deepest appreciation to Dr. Phil Rush.
Thank you. Thank you.